In the name of open government, Patten went on the offensive from the start. Hoping to secure their respect, if not their allegiance, he invited the media to Government House.
Very pleased to have started work this morning in earnest. I'll be spending as much time as I possibly can out of the office, visiting the citizens of Hong Kong in their own homes and communities.
Inside, it seemed much like any other debating chamber in a free society. But it wasn't. Of the 60 seats here when Patten arrived, only 18 were directly elected. The rest were either appointed by the governor or selected by the most powerful and prominent groups in the society. Patten wanted to change that, but his room for manoeuvre was limited. Under this, the Joint Declaration of 1984, Britain agreed to return Hong Kong to China. The treaty made no reference to democracy, although it was agreed that this LegCo would be constituted after 1997 by, and I quote, elections, though what form these elections might take was carefully left open. The other sacred text was China's Basic Law of 1990, a sort of mini-constitution for Hong Kong, in which Beijing undertook to extend democracy with the aim, ultimately, and rather vaguely, of reaching one person, one vote. Ultimately. Within the terms of these two sacred texts, Patten had to devise a framework for the 1995 elections. In private, from the very beginning, he was absolutely clear about his intentions.
What I propose doing is finding all those bits of elbow room that I think exist between the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law for bedding democracy down or extending it. There are a lot of ways, I think, in which we could broaden the democratic structure of the Legislative Council without, in the short term, taking the Chinese on something which they regard as a fundamental issue.
Patten knew that that would be easier said than done, that to meet the growing demand for democracy in Hong Kong was bound to set the alarm bells ringing in Beijing, where the very idea of greater democracy reeked of British treachery and subversion.
I mean, I think there are two worries, two aspects of paranoia. One, that somehow we're trying to rip them off, rip Hong Kong off, rip off China. When the Royal Yacht came into Hong Kong a few years ago, there was a rumour went round that it had come in to take the gold away. And that is still, I think, a suspicion that some of our interlocutors, there's a good non-piratical word for you, have. Secondly, I think some of them suspect that having come to democracy rather late in Hong Kong, we're trying to construct some democratic time bomb to blow their system to smithereens.
Patten did not intend to detonate any such time bomb, but he already knew enough on his second day in office to suspect that the political reforms he had in mind would provoke a severe reaction in Beijing, and therefore that the so-called through train, by which it was hoped that everyone elected to this council in 1995 would travel safely through 1997 and beyond, that through train could easily be derailed.
What you'll first of all see is denunciatory articles in their newspapers here. And what they will say is we've got to have, if you want a through train, it's got to be on tracks that we agree with. I fear that they will want tracks that we would regard as totally unacceptable. But I think that if I can keep the argument within the framework which I've described, of the Joint Declaration on the one hand and the Basic Law on the other, I can probably get away with it.
2 months after his arrival and 6 days before he was to make the most important speech of his political life, Patten paid a duty call on Beijing's diplomatic outpost in Hong Kong, the New China News Agency. He was there to celebrate China's National Day, in the full knowledge that his hosts suspected foul play, that he had broken their rules, that he was about to defy them by introducing a new structure for democratic development in Hong Kong without seeking their permission first, that in their terms, but on Hong Kong's behalf, he had refused to kowtow. Patten also defied the rules by refusing to deliver his speech to the Chinese in advance. He spoke off the cuff instead.
There's a real danger in the sort of position I'm in of turning up at the end of the day with a wonderfully sensible, rational policy which nobody agrees with. A sensible, rational policy which the Liberals, Martin Lee and co don't agree with because it doesn't go far enough, and which the Conservatives don't agree with because it goes too far and annoys China. And I could easily fetch up with a wonderfully well thought out policy which only Chris Patten thought was sensible.
That the governor is putting forward all these proposals without even making a pretense that he has talked to them first or consulted them first. I think this is the thing which would upset China most.
Do you like the fact that he's doing it this way?
Oh, absolutely. I think that is the only way to do it.
We've been getting signals from Peking, storm warnings rather than signals, for the best part of a week. It's of course the way Peking customarily does business. So it's a bit difficult to know whether it's any different now from other times.
It was different. Although Beijing had agreed in principle that Hong Kong should have a more democratic system for the upcoming 95 elections, the Chinese were furious that Britain had dared to refuse their demand for a secret veto over the governor's blueprint. Instead, they were only handed the details at the last moment.
Then last Saturday, our ambassador was summoned and given a stern note from Mr. Lu Ping. At the same time, we had 2 calls along private channels saying how furious the Chinese were, and all the messages, both formal and informal, said that I should not make my proposals on 1995, that I should keep quiet about them until I discussed them with China. But I expect Peking to be pretty savage and try to frighten the community here into turning their back on the proposals I've got for greater democratization, modest though they are. That's the way things have played in the past, and I imagine that the rhetorical thunderbolts will start raining down.
So the pace of democratization in Hong Kong is, we all know, necessarily constrained. But it is constrained, not stopped dead in its tracks. Standing still is not an available option. Hong Kong's way of life.
Patten's blueprint did not call for any more directly elected seats, but he did seek to increase the number of indirectly elected seats, and most dramatically, to give almost every working adult the right to vote in these so-called functional constituencies.
What these arrangements should give us, therefore, is a through train of democracy running on the tracks laid down by the Basic Law.
Hong Kong was astounded, the international media was bowled over, and the Democrats were delighted.
I must say, after those 5 years of Wilson governorship, they simply didn't trust the British at all. But yesterday when they heard it, they were so shocked. It's really almost complete disbelief, because there were a number of very good ideas which we never thought of, like those 9 constituency seats. Well, effectively, because it is so wide, it's almost like democratic elections.
The proposals that I made yesterday, proposals for discussion with China, were entirely consistent with the Basic Law and the Joint Declaration. They were consistent in every part. And frankly, it is for others, if they disagree with me, to point out where my proposals are inconsistent and to put forward their own proposals.
What they've done is to go into a tactic which they understand, which is to orchestrate the pro-Peking press in Hong Kong, denounce me. There were, I think,
up to Saturday morning there'd been 40 commentaries or editorials calling me a running dog over the previous week. I think there were another 20 over the weekend. It's been much more personalised than attacks ever have been before, and I think pretty vitriolic. But as I said this morning, if they think this is bad, they should read the British press. They are absolutely obsessed with Martin Lee. I mean, unbelievably so. And I suspect it's what trickles down from the leadership. But they're obsessed with Martin Lee, with Hong Kong becoming a focus for unrest in China, with the threat that they may not have control over Hong Kong. And they also think that we've pulled a fast one on them by finding ways of extending democracy indirectly.
The governor had barely left Chinese soil before his opposite number delivered his parting shot.
We
do not want to make public the differences between our two sides. In our view, the essence of the issue or the essence of our differences is not whether the pace of democracy in Hong Kong should be accelerated. The essence, according to us, is whether there should be still cooperation or whether there will be confrontation. If the other side insists on confrontation, we have no other choice.
Then George Shultz said, as soon as you leave, as soon as the aircraft doors shut, there'll be a blast. They'll have a press conference and they'll denounce you. And again, absolutely right.
Exactly so. But is it proving? I mean, are they putting a lot of pressure on now?
Yeah.
And
I'm afraid that what they're trying to do is frighten people into thinking the game's not worth the candle. We might as well give in.
Playing tennis on my own is a fairly fruitless occupation. Unless the ball comes back over the net, it's rather difficult to have a cooperative game. And what we're talking about here isn't a game. What we're talking about is the prosperity, the stability, and the way of life of Hong Kong.
Some people have been made nervous by old-fashioned threats or intimidation. Even as you denounce Patton and his works now, you'll have great difficulty getting this or that franchise after 1997. You'll have great difficulty doing business in Guangdong. I mean, that point is put very bluntly and openly to people.
You know that for a fact?
Oh, I know that for a 18-carat fact, including some all sorts of ways, some of which would offend your and my civil libertarian consciences.
However, inside the Foreign Office, key officials argued that Patton's confrontation would inflict severe damage on Sino-British relations. Their views had started to leak into the media. Patton, who despised them as appeasers, asked Hurd to read the Riot Act.
He's going to make it clear to one or two people who are, if not starting to suggest that we should offer reparations at least, that we should start throwing away bits of the policy. I think he's going to want to make it clear that that's not on. I mean, why should one play the game entirely by their rules? Why should one accept their definition of what a principled position is or what consultation is? Wouldn't do it with others, so why should one do it with China? If being a sinologist is taking that view, then I'm quite glad I'm not a sinologist.
And when they tell you he doesn't understand the culture of this great empire of China, he's a parochial, provincial bull in a very delicate china shop, what's the feeling you have in there?
The feeling I have is that if I look back over the last few months, most of the bulls are Chinese.
Many of them were unnerved by the stridency with which China now warned Hong Kong against Patton.
I don't want to underestimate that. They really gave us hell last week. They put immense pressure on the business community, from brutal threats to gentle persuasion. Whatever would work, they used it. They panicked the business community, they panicked the stock exchange, they panicked a good proportion of the public, and they panicked a fair proportion of the civil service.
A part of Hong Kong's admirable political development is that you're not a rubber stamp for the 28th British governor of Hong Kong, and you won't be a rubber stamp after 1997 either. And that is what part of this argument is all about.
What they have set up to date is, before we talk, the triple violator, your humble servant, must actually withdraw his proposals. Now they say the triple violator must withdraw his proposals. But they don't say we won't talk unless he withdraws his proposals. They go on to say the talks must be on the basis of the joint declaration, the basic law, exchange between the foreign secretaries. Fine by me, because one of the things that comes out of a study of those sacred texts is the Chinese commitment to a through train, and we shall be examining in the talks, among other things, exactly what the Chinese mean by that. Because what they at present mean by a through train is that you might get on it in 1995 as a legislator, but if they don't like the look of you, they'll throw you off in 1997. Some train.
And if the talks were to start, what were the odds of success?
3-1 against.
A few days later, the talks about talks turned into negotiations proper.
But there was serious business as well. The talks with China in Beijing had reached round 3.
Bernard's here.
I think Sir Percy, for reasons which I'm sure he'll explain to the world, has moved from being a critic on the sideline to actively working to screw up what we're doing. I guess because, well, any guesses on my part are excessively speculative, so I better not say one.
What is the guess?
Maybe success would be too painful.
I am going with...
When these talks were about to start, you gave them 3-1 against a deal. What's the rating now, the betting?
I think about 50-50. 5 to midnight, I think, rather than 11th hour. More familiar hands, as far as China is concerned, than me, say that this is what always happens, that they wait until the very last moment and then make a move. What we can't tell at the moment is whether the move was mainly meant to slightly wrong-foot the Cabinet Committee meeting, to string us along for a bit longer, or whether it was for real. But it was substantial, and substantial enough in my judgment, probably to be for real.
The governor decided he had to come clean and tell Hong Kong that after 9 months and 18 rounds, the talks had got nowhere. He rehearsed for the questions that would follow his announcement.
Is it worth it? A single-seat, single-vote method of Legco to jeopardise the talks? As there's dead time between the middle of December and the middle of January, why not wait until then and go on talking?
Or until February, or until March, or until April, or May, or maybe June would be. How many rounds do we need? 34? 51?
I don't think anybody else in the world would negotiate like this. We were in serious Lewis Carroll country, in which, first of all, they'd led us on about what they were saying. Secondly, they were saying, we'll only explain what we actually mean if you give up a point of substance, and our explanation of what we mean will be a concession. Well, I mean, you can argue in a sense that there isn't a technical reason why you need the voting age now. You could do it in a month's time.
Patten was privately convinced that the Chinese now had no intention of honouring the joint declaration.
It's perfectly clear that what they want is to control the Legislative Council as part of their intention to control and run Hong Kong.
And things may change between now and 1997. Things may change in Peking. But they give every indication of simply not believing in Hong Kong people running Hong Kong in one country, two systems. It's all there in the text, but the subtext and everything they do tells a very different story.
Is it true the Chinese backtracked in rounds 16 and 17 after an agreement was close in round 15?
Yes, they're a bunch of wankers.
The governor decided to go on the offensive. Not just a statement to Legco, but a media blitz as well. Its purpose, to steady Hong Kong's nerves.
What we're trying to do is to salvage the talks, not to scupper the talks. Hi, how are you?
Surely China will ask, what's the point of sitting around the table with this guy? So if he doesn't get his own way, he'll just go out and do exactly what he wants to do.
Hi!
Nice to see you.
Do you think Britain can still achieve the honourable retreat from Hong Kong?
Hi! The purpose of my statement today was to give us more time to deal with the biggest and most controversial issues. I think this is the biggest crunch so far. I think over the next 3-6 months will be a bit uncomfortable. I dare say there are some who would argue if China was saying, well, our price is slaughter of the firstborn, who would say, well, maybe it's not unreasonable in the circumstances. You have to allow for different cultural traditions. Do we ever have a bottom line?
In my experience with the Beijing leadership, in my book, you should say everything to them privately and agree what you're going to say publicly. The simple answer is this: it's not kowtowing to Beijing. It's simply the best way of getting agreement out of them.
Despite some British officials in London and Beijing who were only too happy to accommodate China, Patten stood firm. And in February 1994, he published this white paper, which charts the tortuous path towards the breakdown with China. And at the same time, he put his original reform package into the Legislative Council.
We've said at every stage, in terms, that we would argue vigorously and work very hard to get our proposals through. But I'm not saying that we won't find any amendment acceptable. The refusal to rule out any amendment at all produces yet again charges of conspiracy. But I went through the 8, 9, 10 previous occasions on which Martin and his friends had said we were about to rat on them, and pointed out patiently that it was actually 18 months on and still no rat. So maybe they should just be a bit more patient.
What do you expect now from the Chinese? Or don't you know?
I now have sufficient confidence in my knowledge of China and the Chinese to say that we haven't got the faintest idea. I think that there is a very good chance, though I don't intend saying it very much in public, because it just pushes them into saying, Yao Bu, you're wrong. I think there is a very good chance of the electoral arrangements we put in place this year surviving through 97.
The Legislative Council finally met to decide the fate of Patten's proposals for more democracy in Hong Kong. If he won, it would be a huge personal triumph. If he lost, he'd be humiliated and very probably finished as well. At the start of what was to be a very long day, he had absolutely no idea which way the vote would go.
But, sir, the intense last-minute lobbying, the 17-18 months...
If Patten's team was lobbying hard, the Chinese government was interfering directly in Hong Kong's internal affairs.
Lu Ping rang Pang Zhenghai at Legco and tell Pang Zhenghai, all I ask of you is to leave the chamber when they put it to vote. Disappear in the toilet anyway. Just don't vote. And Pang Zhenghai said, I will not do that.
Bloody hell.
So he's tried with both in fact
found Pang Zhenghai.
They saw this where the swings are.
It was not the margin they wanted, but it would kill the Liberal amendment.
Members, please proceed to vote.
queries? If not, the results will now be displayed. The result is 28 for the eyes, 29 for the nose.
Yes!
The nose.
Yes! It's just that close! Yes!
Would members please proceed to vote?
After a few minor amendments, the patent bill in its original blueprint went through with a resounding majority.
The result is 32 for the eyes, 24 for the nose.
She's in the fame box.
Oh, I love you. We've just won.
But to be serious, it was a terrific day. It was the end of 2 years. Bumps, ups and downs, horrors, holes in the road. And we've got it all through, and we've kept things together.
I think it's increased the strength of some people's feelings that there is a cornucopia in China waiting to flow over our slippered feet. If only we would recognize the importance of, quote, restoring good relations with China, unquote. Billions of business waiting to be done if only we show our sincerity in our dealings with China over Hong Kong.
Although Heseltine was entirely loyal, the Foreign Secretary was only too aware that the President of the Board of Trade was exceedingly frustrated.
Michael Heseltine sees this immense market growing at a huge rate. He sees the Germans and the French powering in huge delegations. He wants to do the same. He's extremely good at it. And Hong Kong is an impediment to that process. It's something he accepts. It has to be dealt with and so on. But it's impediment to what he sees as a huge opportunity. I think I'm correctly analysing his view.
Although Heseltine did not deviate from Britain's official line, Patten suspected that he had some sympathy with a Whitehall school of diplomacy which the governor deplored.
There are those who think that if you don't have any arguments with China, if you have lots of visits and meetings, if you sign polite communiques, it will sooner or later deliver Chinese agreement on policies to which they've previously been inimical. I think that's complete drivel. There's a difference between real diplomacy and shaking hands and smiling.
Patten's frustration with the Heseltine visit was fueled by another conflict with China, this time about the rule of law. For week after week, the two sides have been wrangling about the status and the powers of the Court of Final Appeal that was to replace the Privy Council as the final arbiter of the law on July the 1st, 1997. On this occasion, though, there was a compromise, to the outrage of the Democrats.
The deal with Beijing confirmed China's right to exclude all so-called acts of state, treason, secession, and subversion, from the jurisdiction of the Court of Final Appeal. The power in these critical areas would thus lie not in Hong Kong, but in China. The Democrats feared that the Chinese would exploit their authority over acts of state to crush dissidents in Hong Kong, just as they did on the mainland. Patten claimed that Martin Lee had simply missed the point.
Ever since the Basic Law was drafted, the context within which a Court of Final Appeal was going to operate in relation to acts of state was clear. That isn't changed one bit by the agreement that we signed this summer. The frustration is to have the argument turned to issues on which one can't give reassurance. If Martin spends the next 2 years saying it is all going to be hopeless, Hong Kong is finished, it's a disaster, I can give my opinion on that, which is maybe sometimes matched against his, but I can't stop people in this community and elsewhere becoming either excessively fatalist about Hong Kong or excessively pessimistic about Hong Kong.
In private, the tycoons admitted that it wasn't only China that bothered them, but the will of the people itself.
If you look at the electorate
the merchants are a small minority of the society. And therefore, if you go on a one-man, one-vote situation, the so-called bottom of the pyramid, where people are looking at their own welfare, that will dominate in terms of how government should be run, in terms of how taxation should be levied, and so forth. I mean, if you want Hong Kong to be a merchant city, then there are certain parameters you like to play. But if you don't want Hong Kong to be a merchant city, I think the one-man, one-vote situation sounds very plausible to a Western eye.
I'm going to China this afternoon. I'm going to tell them that in the next 2 years, they really have to consider, let Hong Kong people do as much as possible. And the Chinese government and their representative in Hong Kong should involve less in Hong Kong affairs. Let the Hong Kong people take the driver's seat.
By pure accident, the man who got me into politics in the first place, a nice American, has been staying this weekend, and he's been absolutely captivated by the whole business. And he went round polling stations yesterday on his own, and he said to me today, you know what was wonderful was seeing all these people who are proud of their freedom practicing it. It's perfectly clear that what they want is to control the Legislative Council as part of their intention to control and run Hong Kong. And things may change between now and 1997. Things may change in Peking. But they give every indication of simply not believing in Hong Kong people running Hong Kong in one country, two systems.
It's worrying that a community which is not prepared to face the realities about its future is in serious trouble. And Hong Kong is simply not prepared to face up to the fact that the Communist Party is going to have a profound influence on Hong Kong's way of life. The Chinese Communist Party was a Marxist-Leninist party. It's lost its Marxism. All that's left is the Leninism. And that means control, order and control. And there is no way on this earth that they are going to allow a high degree of autonomy in Hong Kong.
Well, but this is precisely what we have to fight for, our own identity, and it becomes more urgent because we're going to become a part of China. I don't know whether I can ever stand up and say, I'm a citizen of the People's Republic of China.
Now, we know already from the way, and this is a point which President Trump has been right to indicate, we know already that in relation to the WTO access and negotiations, and I was part of the European team during that period, the Chinese have slipped and slithered away from what they promised they would do. So it's much more difficult for a Western company to invest in China or sell to China than it is for a Chinese company to do the same the other way around. So you ask yourself, if you can't trust China on that, can you trust China elsewhere? And I think the way they behave in Hong Kong, they are treaty bound to try to keep Hong Kong as it's been for the last years, for the next 30. If you can't trust them in Hong Kong, I think people will start to raise questions about where you can trust them.